All right, so we've got this quote here. Renaissance philosophy consisted, broadly speaking, of a series of footnotes to Aristotle.
Mm.
Whitehead said, and it just immediately kind of hits you with the just huge influence of Aristotle on, the whole way people thought in the Renaissance.
Yeah. And what's really interesting is even though that quote really does point to like Aristotle being at the center of everything, it also kind of sets the stage for this much more like complex and dynamic intellectual landscape than just like, accepting everything Aristotle said.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Not just like everyone just said, oh yeah, Aristotle's right about everything, let's just all agree. And that's what brings us to today's deep dive.
Mm-hmm.
Aristotelianism in the Renaissance. So
Okay.
like roughly 1350 to 1650.
Okay.
And, when we talk about this for you, it's important to remember that it wasn't just this like single system that everyone accepted, silly and completely.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is like the first really important thing that we get from our sources, especially from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry. It's like this old view of Renaissance Aristotelianism being like this one unified, unchanging kind of just like university doctrine thing has been like completely overturned by scholars like Krista Deller, Nardi Schmidt. And their work has shown that it was actually like way more diverse.
So not just one single flavor of Aristotelianism like that everyone was into.
Yeah, exactly. Like current scholarship really focuses on Renaissance Aristotelianism's plural. So you see all these different interpretations, different schools of thought, even within that like Aristotelian framework. And what's really interesting is that even with, this exciting like resurgence of Platonism during this time and like the rise of humanism, Aristotle didn't just become like some irrelevant figure from the past. He was still a philosopher, the one everyone had to engage with, the one to either build upon or argue against.
And it sounds like we've got a really good source for this today. This Stanford Encyclopedia entry, it sounds like it gives us like this really broad and deep look into this whole world.
Yeah.
So our goal today is to like pull out the most interesting and important stuff about Aristotle's influence during the Renaissance and maybe show you some surprising things you might not expect. And like the intellectual battles people were having about this stuff.
Yeah.
But we don't want to get too bogged down in like too much detail.
Yeah, we want to give you a good, clear understanding of why Aristotle was so important and the kinds of like debates people had as they were, working with his ideas and figuring out how they fit into, a world that was changing.
Right. And this brings me to like this crazy point, like just the sheer amount of intellectual energy that people were putting into Aristotle at this time. So from like 1500 to 1650, there are more Latin commentaries written about his works than in the previous like 1,000 years.
Yeah.
Like that just blows my mind.
Yeah.
I mean, for us as philosophers, that's just like, oh my gosh, the amount of attention he was getting.
It really shows you how much scrutiny and debate was going on around his work.
Yeah.
It wasn't just like, oh, we've inherited this ancient wisdom and now we're just going to, accept it. It was more like a really active engagement with his ideas.
So let's talk about like the history of how Aristotle's influence developed. It's not like he had a huge impact right away in the ancient world.
Right. Compared to Plato, it actually took a bit longer for Aristotle to really make his mark in the ancient world. Like Roman thinkers and early church fathers knew about him, but Plato was definitely more popular. Even someone like Augustine, much later was still primarily influenced by Plato.
So when did things change?
So the 12th and 13th centuries are when things start to shift. You have what people call this rediscovery of a lot more of Aristotle's writings.
Okay.
And this happened at the same time as universities were growing, which kind of makes sense. Maybe they found that Aristotle's systematic approach gave them like a good foundation for philosophical inquiry. Think about this. The Aldous Greek edition that came out in the late 1400s had all of Aristotle's works in like 5 huge volumes.
Wow.
And even before that, Latin translations and even translations into everyday languages had already made his ideas available for centuries.
So it's not like people were only reading Aristotle's original writings, in isolation. There was this whole world of interpretation that had sprung up around them.
Totally. There was this amazing tradition of commentary that developed in Greek, Arabic, Hebrew, and medieval Latin scholarship. You have these super influential figures like Averroes, who was known for his deep commentaries on Aristotle's logic and metaphysics.
Yeah.
And then you have Albert the Great, who played this crucial role in bringing Aristotelian thought into a Christian framework.
Right.
And then, of course, there's Aquinas, whose synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology really became like the dominant interpretation in the medieval period. So all of these people really shaped how people understood and passed on Aristotle's ideas. ideas. It's like you couldn't really engage with Aristotle without also engaging with this long history of interpretation.
And the range of topics that Aristotle wrote about was just mind-blowing, wasn't it? It wasn't just limited to one narrow area of philosophy.
Absolutely. Logic, natural philosophy, which is kind of what we would call science today.
Hmm.
Moral philosophy is metaphysics, which is explores all these fundamental questions about being, rhetoric, poetics. He basically tackled every major branch of knowledge.
Right.
And even some works on natural theology and medicine that turned out to not actually be written by him were still attributed to him and taken super seriously. So this vast scope of his work is a big reason why he became so central to so many different areas of study, not just philosophy, but also medicine, law, theology, and even literary theory.
So basically, if you were an intellectual in the Renaissance, you were bound to run into Aristotle in some form.
Pretty much, yeah.
And it sounds like which parts of Aristotle people were most interested in also changed over time.
Yeah, so while logic and natural philosophy were the main focus in the early period, there was a noticeable rise in interest in rhetoric and poetics during the 15th century, especially among humanists.
Yeah.
They saw how Aristotle's insights into communication and literature were super relevant to classical education and to public life.
So all this rediscovery, all this writing and commentary and engagement across all these different fields.
Yeah.
But where was this all happening? Was it only in universities?
Well, universities were definitely major centers for studying Aristotle, but the conversations about his work went way beyond those walls. You had these informal groups of scholars, you had more official academies like the Accademia degli Infiammati and the Accademia Fiorentina,
Mm.
and even royal courts like King Henri III of France was known for getting involved in philosophical discussions. All of these places became spaces for people to read, debate, and interpret Aristotle.
So Aristotle was like woven into the fabric of Renaissance life. And the role of language in spreading these ideas was pretty important, wasn't it?
Hugely important. The Renaissance saw a big push to translate Aristotle's work into everyday languages like French, Italian, Spanish, English, and German.
Oh, yeah.
And that definitely made his ideas more accessible, even though, as our source points out, it wasn't like a total democratization of knowledge. You
Yeah.
still needed to be literate and educated, and those books were often really expensive.
But even with those limitations, we see signs of more people engaging with Aristotle's work, don't we? Like figures like Benedetto Varchi, who came from a craftsman background,
Right.
and women like Camilla Erculiani, who are writing about Aristotelian topics.
Yeah.
All of that suggests that the circle of people who are participating in these discussions was expanding.
Definitely. And at the same time as the audience was getting wider, the ways people were engaging with Aristotle's ideas were also changing.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about formal academic commentaries anymore. You find people writing letters, dialogues, speeches, paraphrases, even literary works like the Stories of Marguerite de Navarre that are all grappling with these concepts in different creative ways.
So it was like this really vibrant intellectual scene with people constantly reinterpreting and debating the ideas of this one central figure.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's dive into some of those key areas of study that you mentioned. You said logic was like the foundation.
Yeah, logic was the starting point. It gave people those basic principles of reasoning that underpin philosophy, but also other areas like law, theology, and medicine. You had what was called the Logic of Vedas, meaning Old Logic, which was based on translations of Aristotle's logical works by Boethius.
Okay.
And then in the 12th century, when more of Aristotle's writings were rediscovered, you had the Logica Nova, the New Logic, which was based on his complete Organon.
And people weren't just reading those dense original treatises on logic, right?
Right. There were these popular handbooks like Peter of Spain's Summaries of Logic and Paul of Venice's Small Logic that people use as introductions. And then there's this interesting figure, Rudolf Agricola, who argued for combining logic and rhetoric. He wanted to bring together the rigor of logical thinking with the art of persuasion.
Interesting. Okay, so what about natural philosophy? What were the main things people were focusing on there?
So typically students would start with Aristotle's major works on the natural world, like the Physics on the Heavens and on the Soul. Then they'd move on to his minor works, which covered things like generation and corruption weather patterns and the study of animals.
Okay.
And even some of those writings that weren't actually by Aristotle.
Right.
And then you have the metaphysics, which was sometimes studied separately, especially in Northern European universities. But it was also a big part of natural philosophy because people were trying to understand the fundamental principles of the physical world.
What about moral philosophy? That's where the focus shifts to ethics and politics, right?
Exactly. Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics was super important in moral philosophy discussions, and it was often studied alongside the economics and the politics, especially in universities in Central and Northern Europe. It's interesting, though, because at first, moral philosophy had some trouble getting accepted as a formal subject in Italian universities, where other intellectual traditions were more influential.
Hmm. And we can't forget rhetoric and poetics, which became really popular during the Renaissance.
Yeah, those subjects were usually taught in humanities courses, and they focused on things like effective speaking and writing and the principles of literary composition.
Hmm.
And there was this challenge of trying to fit Aristotle's ideas about rhetoric in with the already established authority of Cicero in that field.
Right.
But the publication of the Aldous Greek edition of these works and the interest of humanist scholars like Erasmus really helped to popularize their study.
So across all these different fields, Renaissance thinkers were engaging with Aristotle's writings and all that commentary that had built up over the centuries, and they were actively trying to apply his ideas, often within the context of their own Christian beliefs.
Mm.
And that sounds like a recipe for some intellectual tension and disagreement.
Yeah, for sure. Well, the general view, especially after Aquinas, was that you could basically reconcile Aristotle's philosophy with Christian doctrine.
Right.
Renaissance thinkers were also aware of potential problems and conflicts.
Hmm.
And as they became more familiar with other ancient philosophies, especially Platonism,
Okay.
some started to think that maybe Plato was a better fit with Christian thought, especially when it came to things like the nature and immortality of the soul.
Mm.
And this underlying worry is reflected in a papal bull called Apostolici Regimenis that came out in 1513. It basically urged university professors to actively refute any philosophical arguments that went against Christian dogma.
So let's get into some of those specific points of conflict.
Uh,
Cosmology seems like a major one, especially with the rise of the idea that the sun is at the center of the solar system.
Absolutely. The traditional view of the universe, which came from Aristotle and was developed by Ptolemy and made really popular by Dante's Divine Comedy, placed the earth at the center of everything.
Right.
And this view fit with some interpretations of the Bible. But then you have Copernicus and then the groundbreaking work of Kepler Brahe and Galileo, who all presented strong evidence based on observations and math that actually the sun was at the center.
Right.
And this directly challenged the Aristotelian idea of this perfect, unchanging, Earth-centered universe. And of course, this led to a lot of conflict, like the famous condemnation of Galileo by the church.
And it wasn't just about where the Earth was in relation to the sun.
Right.
The whole nature of the universe was up for debate.
Exactly. You have thinkers like Giordano Bruno who were pushing the boundaries and speculating about the possibility of an infinite universe and multiple worlds.
Wow.
Ideas that were totally at odds with the traditional Aristotelian view of a finite cosmos with a single special Earth at the center.
And another big point of disagreement was the age of the world, right?
Hmm.
Aristotle argued that the universe had always existed,
Hmm.
which is a very different view from the biblical account of creation.
That's right. While some people during the Renaissance did support Aristotle's idea of an eternal universe, it mostly clashed with the core Christian belief in creation out of nothing, which had become firmly established as like official doctrine.
Right.
Some figures like Pelicani and Vernia actually got into trouble for advocating for the eternity of the world. And it's interesting because even some Platonists entertain the idea of an eternal world, which adds another layer of complexity because now you've got this debate even within the ranks of these revered ancient authorities.
And Aristotle's views on divine intervention in the natural world also differed from Christian doctrine.
Yeah. In Aristotle's philosophy, the natural world basically operated according to its own internal principles without God constantly stepping in and messing with things, at least in the earthly realm. But from a Christian perspective, this raised questions about divine providence, God's active involvement in the world.
Right.
Thinkers like Melanchthon and Ramus thought that this Aristotelian view just didn't square with the Christian belief in a God who guides and intervenes in human affairs and in nature.
So Renaissance Aristotelianism wasn't just about accepting Aristotle's physics. It was about constantly negotiating these big theological questions.
Exactly.
And then you have the whole issue of the soul, which seems super complex, trying to reconcile Aristotle's ideas about the soul with Christian beliefs about the individual and immortal soul.
Yeah, that was a central issue, and it sparked tons of debate. Christian doctrine is very clear that the human soul is individual and immortal. But Aristotle's concept of hylomorphism, the idea that the soul is the form of the body, suggested this really close connection between them.
Right.
So this raised big questions about whether the soul could exist without the body and therefore whether it could be immortal. And then to make things even more complicated, you have Ergoros's interpretation of the intellect.
Hmm.
He saw it as this single universal entity, which kind of preserves a form of immortality, but it does it by getting rid of individual souls.
Hmm.
And that also caused problems from a Christian point of view.
So you've got these different schools of thought popping up. The Alexandrists, who lean towards the idea that individual souls are mortal, based on certain interpretations of Aristotle. And then you have the Averroists, who went with this idea of a universal intellect.
Yeah.
And then comes Pomponazzi, whose work really stirred things up.
Oh, yeah. Pomponazzi's treatise on the immortality of the soul basically argued that you couldn't philosophically prove that the soul was immortal, which was a very provocative claim, especially since it came out right after that papal bull we talked about. And even though Pomponazzi did throw in a quick acknowledgement that Christians believe in immortality based on faith, the idea that maybe you don't need an immortal soul to be rewarded for being good really upset a lot of people.
So he really pushed some buttons. But it sounds like he managed to avoid being condemned.
He did, partly because he had some powerful patrons protecting him. But the debates about the nature and immortality of the soul didn't stop with him. People like Porzio and Zabarella kept exploring these questions, while others fiercely defended the traditional Christian view, often using Plato's ideas about the separability and inherent immortality of the soul.
And moral philosophy also presented some challenges because Aristotle's ethical framework, which is all about pursuing eudaimonia or flourishing through virtue and habit,
Right.
that was focused on finding fulfillment in this earthly life.
Right.
It didn't really emphasize things like divine grace and the ultimate good, which are central to Christian thought.
Exactly. For Christians, God is the ultimate good, and Aristotle's focus on happiness and fulfillment in this life seemed incomplete and maybe even misguided. Aquinas and later thinkers tried to work through this by combining Aristotelian ethics with the Christian idea of the highest good, or summum bonum.
Okay.
Like Leonardo Bruni actually translated the Greek term tagathon as summum bonum in Latin, which shows this effort to reinterpret Aristotelian concepts in a way that fit with Christianity.
And there was a difference in how they understood virtue, too.
Yeah. Aristotle emphasized developing virtues through habit and reason, while Christian theology stressed the importance of God's grace, love, faith, and humility.
Right.
So Christian commentators acknowledged that Aristotle's analysis of virtue was valuable, but they also said that it was incomplete without these fundamental Christian elements. Melanchthon, for example, recognized that Aristotelian virtues were useful for maintaining social order, but he also pointed out their limitations from a theological point of view. And then there's this connection Aristotle makes between ethics and politics.
Okay.
He emphasized the importance of the virtuous ruler and the good of the state. Renaissance humanists took that idea and extended it to the concept of republican virtue.
Interesting.
But then you have thinkers like Machiavelli who offered a more practical and sometimes almost amoral view of how to succeed in politics. And that view maybe separated political success from traditional ideas about ethics.
So the Renaissance was this incredible period of intellectual energy, with people constantly trying to put together all these different ideas, with Aristotelianism being a central point of reference, but also with a growing awareness of its limitations and the ways it conflicted with other traditions and with core Christian beliefs.
Absolutely. And you even start to see philosophers like Pomponazzi arguing that philosophy and theology should be separate areas of knowledge, which was a big shift from Aquinas' earlier attempts to create this grand synthesis. And as people had access to more ancient sources besides Aristotle, they started to see that there were deeper and more fundamental differences between these traditions. So they started engaging with these authorities in a more critical and less reverent way.
So Platonism had a big comeback during this period, didn't it?
Fueled by the translation of more of Plato's works into Latin, especially Marsilio Ficino's famous 1484 edition of Plato's Complete Dialogues.
Okay.
And this led to all these debates about who was better, Plato or Aristotle, with some people saying that Plato was definitely superior. Plato's ideas about the immortality and the non-physical nature of the soul resonated more easily with Christian theology.
Right.
And people like Ficino really worked hard to create this big synthesis of Platonism, Aristotelianism, and Christianity.
Wow.
He believed that there was this kind of like underlying wisdom that was present in both pagan and Judeo-Christian traditions. You can see that in his book, Platonic Theology. And many other thinkers also tried to find ways to reconcile the ideas of these two giants of ancient philosophy.
What about other philosophical schools like Stoicism, Epicureanism, and skepticism? How did those fit into this world where Aristotelianism was so dominant?
Well, Stoicism, which emphasizes virtue, reason, and self control, did appeal to some people, especially after they rediscovered thinkers like Seneca and Epictetus.
Hmm.
And humanist scholars like Justus Lipsius were really important in making Stoicism more acceptable in a Christian context. They pointed out the similarities between Stoic ethics and Christian teachings. But Stoicism also had its critics. People like Erasmus and Montaigne didn't like how austere it was, and they had issues with some of its views, like on suicide. And then there's Epicureanism, which had a bad reputation because people associated it with pleasure-seeking and materialism.
Hmm.
But some Renaissance thinkers, like Quevedo, offered a more nuanced interpretation, and they even tried to find some common ground between Epicureanism and Christian thought.
Hmm.
And the rediscovery of key texts like Diogenes Laertius's Lives of Eminent Philosophers and Lucretius's De Rerum Natura gave people direct access to these philosophies.
Right.
Skepticism also posed a challenge to Aristotelianism, with thinkers like Sextus Empiricus becoming known again. Figures like Francisco Sanchez in his work That Nothing is Known launched this skeptical attack on the very foundations of Aristotelian thinking and how we acquire knowledge.
Hmm.
And Pierre Gassendi specifically criticized Aristotelian physics from an Epicurean and skeptical perspective.
So these other philosophical currents often served as critiques of the dominant Aristotelian view.
Exactly.
And by the late Renaissance, we start to see a more pronounced anti-Aristotelian movement.
Right.
Uh,
Especially in Italy in the late 1500s. You have thinkers like Francesco Patrizzi Bernardino, Telesio Giordano, Bruno Tommaso Campanella, and Cesare Cremonini, who were all strongly criticizing Aristotelian natural philosophy. They often argued for more empirical approaches and new ways of understanding the natural world.
uh,
And sometimes their ideas got them into trouble with the church. Even Galileo's revolutionary observations and theories in astronomy and physics implicitly challenged the Aristotelian framework.
right.
And these critiques also influenced thinkers in other parts of Europe, like Marie Mersenne and René Descartes. England was a bit of a special case because there was already a bias against Aristotelianism, partly because people linked it to Catholic scholasticism.
Hmm.
And you see this in Francis Bacon's critique of Aristotle's reliance on final causes.
Our source also mentions how Aristotelianism even intersected with new developments like international law, especially when it came to Aristotle's concept of natural slavery in the context of the Spanish colonization of the New World.
Yeah, that's a really important point that shows how philosophical ideas can have real-world consequences.
Absolutely.
So Aristotle's idea that some people are naturally meant to be slaves was directly challenged by the ethical problems of Spanish colonization and how indigenous people were treated. And this led to some big debates, most notably the Valladolid debate, where Sepulveda argued that indigenous people were naturally inferior based on Aristotle's ideas, and Las Casas and Soto argued fiercely against him. So this shows how even these deeply entrenched philosophical ideas were being questioned and reevaluated in light of new realities and new ethical considerations.
So looking back at everything we've talked about, it's so clear that Renaissance Aristotelianism wasn't just a simple matter of everyone accepting a fixed set of ideas.
Yeah, it was so much more than that.
It was this incredibly complex and dynamic intellectual phenomenon.
Totally. It involved rediscovery, intense and long-lasting study, a huge variety of interpretations, and this constant engagement with other influential philosophical traditions, changing religious beliefs and groundbreaking new scientific discoveries. And this engagement often involved a lot of intellectual friction and conflict.
And if we remember that fact we talked about earlier about the sheer number of commentaries written during the Renaissance, it just shows how central Aristotle was to the intellectual life of that period.
Yeah, it really does. It points to this time of huge intellectual change and growth, with Aristotle's thought serving as like a central catalyst for debate innovation and ultimately the emergence of new ways of seeing the world.
So for you listening, think about this. What are the seemingly unshakable intellectual frameworks of our own time that are being debated and challenged, maybe even in ways that future generations will see as turning points? What are our modern-day Aristotles, and how are we wrestling with their legacies as we try to create new paths of thought? It really makes you think about the constantly evolving nature of philosophy.